The Whisper Behind the Glass. Secrets that shatter lives. "Listen to this," Lady Cynthia Drage announced, her voice sharp with curiosity, as she held up a crinkled newspaper with a flourish. She wasn't the kind of woman to miss out on juicy gossip, especially the kind that promised drama. Her bold red lips curled into a smirk as she read aloud, "Mr. and Mrs. Unkerton are entertaining a party at Greenway's house this week. Among the distinguished guests are Lady Cynthia Drage, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Scott, Major Porter, DSO, Mrs. Staverton, Captain Allinson, and Mr. Satterthwaite." Lady Cynthia tossed the paper aside with an air of disdain. "What a mess they've made of it," she declared dramatically, her parasol tapping against her knee. "If only they knew the stories brewing behind those names." Across from her sat Mr. Satterthwaite, a man with a reputation for sniffing out the subtle comedies and tragedies of human life. If there was drama brewing at Greenway's house, you could bet your last shilling he'd be there, observing quietly, soaking in every detail. Today, his sharp eyes lingered on Lady Cynthia's heavily made-up face, a mask that couldn't quite hide her unrelenting hunger for intrigue. "Don't pretend you don't get it, Satterthwaite," Lady Cynthia snapped, cutting through his silence like a dagger through silk. "You're here for the show, aren't you? To watch the fur fly?" Mr. Satterthwaite leaned back, feigning innocence. "I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about." "Oh, don't play coy," she shot back, her tone dripping with mockery. "You know perfectly well I'm talking about Richard Scott and his charming little bride." At this, Mr. Satterthwaite raised an eyebrow. Richard Scott, the famed big-game hunter, had a reputation as ferocious as the lions he stalked. His tales of adventure had earned him a place in every high-society circle, but today it was his personal life under the microscope. "Yes, Scott's the big-game man," Mr. Satterthwaite admitted cautiously. "Exactly," Lady Cynthia continued, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "And the bride. Moira's a darling girl, barely 20 but completely naive. Can you imagine? She's married to a man who must be at least 45. Lady Cynthia's smirk widened, her painted lips twisting as she leaned even closer. "But that's not the real story, Satterthwaite. Oh no, the shadow hanging over them is far darker. There are whispers about Scott's past, things that don't sit well. Unfinished business, let's call it. And Moira, she's too young to see it, too enchanted by the rugged adventurous facade to realize the danger she might be in." Her parasol, now forgotten, slipped to the floor with a soft thud. The room seemed to hold its breath as Lady Cynthia's voice dropped further, her words weaving a web of suspense. "Have you noticed the way people look at them? At her? It's not admiration, Satterthwaite. It's pity and fear." Mr. Satterthwaite, ever the observer, remained silent, but his mind was alight with possibilities. Richard Scott was a man of tales. Dangerous hunts, close escapes, a life lived on the edge, yet, as Lady Cynthia's insinuations took root, he couldn't help but wonder. What hunts had Scott embarked on in his personal life? What prey had he left behind, wounded or worse? The distant chime of the clock broke the silence, its rhythmic ticking an unrelenting reminder of time passing, and time running out. Mr. Satterthwaite shifted slightly, his gaze steady on Lady Cynthia. "You do love a good scandal, don't you?" he said at last, his tone light, but his words probing. "Oh, darling," she replied with a laugh, though her eyes gleamed with something more serious. "A scandal is nothing if not the truth dressed up in its finest lies. And Greenway's this week?" She paused, savoring the moment. "It's practically bursting at the seams with both." Mr. Satterthwaite allowed himself a small smile. He knew better than to take Lady Cynthia's dramatics at face value, but experience had taught him one thing. Where there was smoke, there was fire. And at Greenway's house the smoke was already thick, curling in unseen corners, waiting to reveal the flames beneath. The anticipation hung heavy between them, unspoken but understood. Whatever secrets Greenway's held, they wouldn't stay buried for long, and when they surfaced, they would shatter more than just the silence. "Mrs. Scott seems lovely," Mr. Satterthwaite said, his voice measured. Lady Cynthia rolled her eyes. "Poor child, that's what she is. And mark my words, she doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. You see, there's more to Richard Scott's story than lions and tigers. There's a ghost in his past, a living ghost, Mrs. Staverton." The name hung in the air like a storm cloud. Even Mr. Satterthwaite, usually unflappable, couldn't suppress a flicker of surprise. He knew the name, of course. Everyone in their circle did. Mrs. Staverton was the kind of woman stories were written about. A traveler, a writer, and, if rumors were to be believed, something far more dangerous. Lady Cynthia leaned in, her voice dropping further. "It's well known, you know. That trip into the interior, Scott and Mrs. Staverton were more than just travel companions." "Were they really?" Mr. Satterthwaite asked, his tone deliberately neutral. "My dear man, don't be naive," she scoffed. "And now the Unkertons, in their infinite social ignorance, have invited them both to this house party. Can you imagine the drama? A former lover, a young wife, and a man like Richard Scott. It's like tossing a lit match into a room full of fireworks." The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Greenway's house, painting the rooms in soft gold and dispelling the shadows of the night. Mr. Satterthwaite stood by one of these windows, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the sprawling gardens. His mind, however, was far from the beauty of the scene. The events of the previous evening had left a distinct impression, one he couldn't shake off. The tension among the guests was palpable, almost like an undercurrent of stormy seas hidden beneath a seemingly calm surface. Iris Staverton, with her dazzling smile and fierce presence, had been at the center of it all, a figure of undeniable magnetism and potential destruction. He recalled her words from the Privy Garden, spoken with such raw intensity. "Jealousy. It drives one to the devil. It is the devil." The memory sent a chill down his spine. Then there was Scott, his low, indistinct reply carrying a weight of uncertainty, like a man teetering on the edge of a precipice. And Moira Scott, the seemingly unaffected wife, was she as oblivious as she appeared? Or was there something brewing beneath her charming, innocent demeanor? Mr. Satterthwaite had always prided himself on being an observer, a connoisseur of human nature, but this time the thread seemed more tangled than ever. The strained dynamics between Iris, Richard, and Moira hinted at a past not entirely buried. And what of Major Porter, the man who had voiced such cryptic warnings the day before? His agitation spoke volumes. Whatever had transpired on that fateful trip with the Scotts and Iris Staverton had clearly left its mark on him, though he danced around the details like a man trying to sidestep quicksand. Even the house itself, with its ghostly tale of the stained window, seemed to echo the turmoil within its walls. That eerie, persistent mark, the face of a cavalier forever etched in the glass, was a symbol, perhaps, of the shadows that history and secrets leave behind. What was it that the window refused to forget, despite being replaced time and again? Was it merely superstition, or was there a deeper, more sinister connection between the haunting and the people gathered here now? And then there was Mrs. Unkerton, fussing about replacing the glass once more, her nervous chatter betraying a deeper unease. She called it a matter of aesthetics, but Mr. Satterthwaite could sense the undercurrent of fear in her defiance. She, too, was touched by the intangible tension that seemed to wrap itself around Greenway's house like an invisible mist. As the day wore on, Mr. Satterthwaite resolved to watch closely. There was a story unfolding, and he could feel its crescendo building. The players were all here, their roles perhaps unwittingly assigned by the weight of the past and the choices of the present. But how would it end? Would tragedy strike as his premonition suggested, or would the storm pass, leaving only whispers of what might have been? For now, all he could do was wait, listen, and observe. And in the quiet corners of Greenway's house, he knew he'd find the clues he sought, if only he looked closely enough. Certainly, it was inevitable under such circumstances. Yet, as the sun rose the next morning, painting Greenway's house in soft golden hues, the fears and forebodings of the night before seemed almost laughable. Surely, the tension in the air, the undercurrent of unsaid words, was nothing more than the natural friction of personalities, heightened by the oppressive atmosphere of an old house burdened with its peculiar legends. Mr. Satterthwaite told himself as much while adjusting his cravat in front of the mirror. "Imagination," he muttered. "Too much imagination and too little exercise. That's the trouble." Yes, a brisk walk in the evening, he decided, would do him a world of good. By the time the clock struck 8, the air outside had cooled into a pleasant twilight. Mr. Satterthwaite, with his habitual precision, suggested to Major Porter that they revisit the clearing to see whether Mrs. Unkerton had indeed replaced the infamous window pane. He framed it as a casual curiosity, though deep within him simmered an itch to dispel the lingering unease from yesterday's unsettling discoveries. "Exercise is what I need," he announced with forced cheerfulness as they strolled through the woods. The path wound upwards, a gentle incline that made him puff slightly but invigorated him nonetheless. Porter, as always, was silent, his face shadowed by thoughts too deep to share. "One does feel, though," Satterthwaite ventured after a while, "that last evening we may have exaggerated the situation somewhat. People, civilized people after all, learn to control their emotions. They have to, don't you think?" Porter's reply was cryptic. "Perhaps," he said after a pause. "But there's a breaking point for everyone, isn't there?" "Breaking point?" Satterthwaite frowned. "Surely not here, not among such company." "Civilization," Porter said, his tone almost musing, "is damned dangerous. You see, there are no safety valves. When the pressure builds—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the darkening forest. "Well, let's hope I'm wrong." They reached the knoll, and there it was, the cursed window. The face, clear as daylight, pressed against the grimy pane. The very sight of it sent an involuntary shiver down Satterthwaite's spine. He squinted at it, then exhaled sharply, trying to laugh it off. "Unchanged," he said lightly. "Mrs. Unkerton hasn't had her way after all." Porter barely glanced at it. His gaze, intense and unyielding, was fixed elsewhere, on the thick undergrowth surrounding the clearing. "It's all connected, you know," he said abruptly. "The house, the window, the people, it's like a pot boiling over." Satterthwaite didn't understand, but before he could reply, the forest exploded with sound. 2 sharp cracks tore through the stillness, followed by a woman's piercing scream. It wasn't the scream of surprise or fear, it was raw, primal, a sound that reached deep into the marrow of your bones. Porter was already moving, racing down the path with the speed of a man half his age. Satterthwaite followed as best he could, his heart pounding, not just from exertion but from a sudden chilling certainty that everything, the legends, the tension, the whispered warnings, had been leading to this moment. They burst onto the lawn just as Richard Scott and Mr. Unkerton appeared from the opposite side. The four men froze, their eyes locking briefly before they turned as one toward the entrance of the privy garden. The cry, the shots, they had come from within. It came from inside, Unkerton whispered hoarsely, pointing with a trembling hand. Porter didn't wait. He plunged into the hedge maze, Satterthwaite right behind him. They rounded the last bend and stopped abruptly, the scene before them burning itself into their minds with dreadful clarity. Two figures lay crumpled on the ground. One was Jimmy Allinson, his jaunty, cynical air forever silenced. The other was Moira Scott, her beauty now as still and cold as marble. Above them stood Iris Stiverton, her face a mask of horror. In her right hand she held a pistol, its barrel still faintly smoking. "Iris!" Porter's voice was rough with shock. "For God's sake, what have you done?" She looked at him then, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. Slowly, as though waking from a dream, she glanced down at the weapon in her hand. "I picked it up," she said faintly. The words echoed in the stillness, but they brought no clarity, no comfort. Around them, the shadows seemed to deepen, the privy garden closing in like a silent, accusatory witness. Mr. Satterthwaite, staring at the lifeless bodies, felt a weight settle in his chest. Not just grief or shock, but the unbearable heaviness of knowing that this tragedy, like the ghostly face in the window, would leave its mark forever. It was Richard Scott who broke the suffocating tension. The iron nerve of the man shone through the crisis like steel catching light. After his first anguished cry, he was composed, steady, the epitome of controlled despair. He knelt down by his wife, his trembling hands caressing her still face, and then gently laid her back on the grass. "Shot from behind," he murmured, his voice rough but determined. The bullet passed clean through. He turned his attention to Jimmy Allinson next, his movements brisk but respectful. The wound on Allinson was unmistakable. The bullet lodged deep in his chest. There was no need for a doctor, no need for hope. Death had already claimed them both. John Porter stepped forward, his presence commanding, his voice sharp and firm. "No one touches anything," he said. "The police must find everything exactly as it is." His words hung in the air like a decree, unchallengeable and absolute. Scott's eyes snapped up, blazing with fury. His gaze locked onto Iris Stiverton, who stood frozen near the holly hedge. Her face was pale, her expression a mask of horror, yet in her right hand she held the damning object. The pistol gleamed darkly in the dimming light, an accusation all its own. "Why?" Scott's voice was barely more than a whisper, choked with disbelief. "Why is that in her hand?" He took a step toward her, his fists clenched, his fury bubbling just below the surface. But Porter, anticipating his friend's move, shifted deliberately to block his path. For a moment, it seemed as though the two men would come to blows, their wills locked in an unspoken battle. Porter's calm, unyielding gaze bore into Scott's searing anger. Then, with a slight shake of his head, Porter spoke with quiet conviction. "No, Richard. It looks like it. But you're wrong." Scott swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice cracking as he replied, "Then why?" He pointed a trembling finger at Iris. "Why is she holding that?" Iris Stiverton finally spoke, her voice a monotone, hollow and detached. "I picked it up." The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples of suspicion and unease through the group. Unkerton, who had been hovering nervously on the periphery, cleared his throat and spoke with a quavering voice. "The police, yes, we must call the police. Immediately." He turned to Scott. You will telephone, won't you?" Someone should stay here, with them. Yes, someone should stay here. Mr. Satterthwaite, ever the polite and composed gentleman, volunteered quietly. "I'll remain," he said, his tone measured and calm. Unkerton, visibly relieved, nodded vigorously. "Yes, yes, very good. I must inform the ladies, Lady Cynthia and my wife. They must be told." With that, he hurried off, his heavy steps fading into the distance. Left alone with the grim scene, Satterthwaite found his gaze drawn to Moira Scott's lifeless form. "Poor child," he murmured, his voice laden with sorrow. "Poor, innocent child." Her delicate features were serene, almost as though she were merely sleeping. A half-smile lingered on her lips, her golden hair ruffled and framing her pale face. But then he noticed something else, a single drop of blood on her earlobe. He leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. One of her pearl earrings was missing, the other still dangling from her opposite ear. The absence struck him as poignant, almost symbolic. He whispered to himself, "An earring, torn away in her fall." Poor child indeed. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his reverie. Inspector Winkfield had arrived, his sharp eyes surveying the scene with the precision of a hawk. The library had been commandeered as the center of operations, and now the inspector addressed those gathered. "As I understand it, gentlemen," he began, his tone brisk, "you'd been walking and were returning to the house when you heard 2 shots and a woman scream?" Porter nodded gravely. "Yes, that's correct." The inspector's eyes narrowed as he pieced together the sequence of events. "You ran toward the Privy Garden from one direction, while Mr. Scott and Mr. Unkerton approached from the other. If anyone had left the garden, they would have had to pass one of you." Porter's voice was steady but carried a weight of dread. "That's correct. No one could have left unseen." The inspector's gaze hardened, his conclusion apparent. "Then the answer is clear. Mrs. Staverton was found inside the garden, holding a pistol from which 2 shots had been fired. The evidence is overwhelming." Scott's jaw tightened, his fists clenching as he glared at Iris, but Porter's hand on his shoulder restrained him. "No, Richard," Porter said quietly, his voice a mix of sadness and resolve. "We must let the truth come out, no matter what it is." The room fell silent, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on everyone present. The inspector's voice broke the stillness. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly, "no matter how dark the truth may be." And as they all stared at the pistol in Iris's trembling hand, the question lingered in the air like an unspoken curse. Was this an act of passion, or was something far more sinister at play? The room seemed heavy with unspoken tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. "I understand there had been previous attachment between her and Mr. Richard Scott," came the hesitant suggestion. Porter's voice shattered the air like thunder. "That's a damned lie." His words rang out hoarse, defiant, charged with an almost primal intensity. The inspector, unfazed, shook his head with the kind of patience born from long years of dealing with outbursts. "What is her own story?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite, his curiosity cutting through the silence. The inspector answered, his tone clipped and matter-of-fact. "She claims she went into the Privy Garden to find some peace and quiet. Just before she rounded the last hedge, she heard the shots. When she turned the corner, she found the pistol at her feet and picked it up. She says no one passed her, and she saw no one in the garden besides the 2 victims." He let the weight of his words sink in, pausing meaningfully. "That's what she says. And even after I cautioned her, she insisted on making a statement." "If she said that," Porter growled, his face ashen, "then she was speaking the truth. I know Iris Staverton." The inspector's expression remained unreadable. "Well, sir," he said, "there'll be time enough to argue that. For now, I've got my duty to do." Porter turned abruptly to Mr. Satterthwaite, desperation flashing in his eyes. "You! Can't you help? Can't you do something?" Mr. Satterthwaite, so often overlooked, felt a surprising surge of pride. He had been appealed to. He, the most insignificant of men, had been called upon by a man like John Porter. He was just about to stammer out a regretful reply when the butler entered with a card on a silver tray. Thompson's voice broke the moment. "A gentleman insists he has an urgent appointment with you, sir," he murmured, handing the card to Mr. Unkerton, who had been slumped in his chair, disengaged from the conversation. Unkerton read the card aloud, almost absently. "Mr. Harley Quinn," he said, frowning. "I remember. We were supposed to talk about a picture. But as things stand—" Mr. Satterthwaite suddenly sprang forward, his voice tinged with awe. "Mr. Harley Quinn? Did you say Harley Quinn? How extraordinary. Major Porter, you asked if I could help you. I think I can. This Mr. Quinn, he's a remarkable man." The inspector sniffed, unimpressed. "Another amateur detective, I suppose?" "No," Mr. Satterthwaite said sharply, "he's not that. But he has a gift, a kind of power. He can make you see what you've already seen but didn't understand. He'll make clear what you've already heard but didn't realize." Moments later, the stranger entered. He was tall, slim, and enigmatic, his face shadowed by the red glow of the lamp, almost as if he wore a mask. His coat bore the faint checkered pattern of an artist's easel, as though he were a painter of human truths. "Mr. Quinn," Satterthwaite began, his voice trembling with hope, "we have a drama here, a tragedy, and I believe you might shed some light on it." Quinn listened, his head tilted ever so slightly as Satterthwaite recounted the tale of the crime. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft yet commanding, laced with an almost hypnotic allure. "It is a sad story," he said. "But the lack of motive, that is what makes it most intriguing." The room seemed to lean in closer. Even the inspector stopped snorting and stood a little straighter. Unkerton broke the silence. "Jealousy," he muttered. "That's the motive. Iris Staverton was jealous of Mrs. Scott. She threatened her. Everyone knows that." Quinn's voice cut through, calm yet incisive. "Yes, jealousy, or perhaps something deeper. But you misunderstand me. I wasn't speaking of Mrs. Scott's murder. I was speaking of Captain Allinson's." Porter straightened, his face alight with a sudden revelation. "You're right, there's something wrong with the whole story. If Iris had intended to shoot Mrs. Scott, she'd have found a way to get her alone. But Captain Allinson, why him? Unless—" His voice trailed off, his mind racing. "Unless Allinson shot her and then himself." The inspector's skepticism was immediate. "That theory doesn't hold water, Major Porter. If Allinson had fired at himself, the cloth near the wound would have been scorched. And even if he did, where's the motive?" Porter's arguments faltered, but Quinn stepped in again, his voice like the whisper of a curtain being drawn back. "In times of crisis, one moment often stands out. One image, one impression. Mr. Satterthwaite, what was that moment for you?" Satterthwaite hesitated, then spoke slowly, as though discovering the truth as he said it. "It wasn't the shots, or even the bodies. It was Mrs. Scott's ear. There was blood, a spot of blood on her ear." The revelation hit the room like a clap of thunder. A fragment of gold wire was produced, the remains of an earring, and the impossible began to take shape. 2 shots, 1 earring, 2 victims, and 1 secret. Quinn's voice, now barely above a whisper, wrapped around them like a spell. let us suppose a jealous man. A man who knows the house's secrets. A man who watches from a hidden window and sees his wife in another man's arms. What does he do? He takes her life, and in a fit of rage, he takes her lover's too. The room seemed to hold its breath. "And the hat?" Porter asked, his voice trembling. Quinn smiled faintly. "A trick, a ghost, a story come to life to disguise the truth." Porter's voice broke. "But he let Iris be accused. How could he?" "Because jealousy blinds. Jealousy destroys." Quinn's tone was heavy with unspoken emotion. "But now, Major Porter, it is time. Go to Iris. She needs you now more than ever." Porter's answer was immediate. "I will." And with that, he was gone. A man who had finally found his purpose.